areas across the Africa. So we need at some point to have this discussion. But linked to this also, I take your point on the borders, that we need to discuss it in the context of a reunion agenda. I'm born in Zimbabwe. My ancestors were born in Mpumalanga. I consider myself a South African, a Zimbabwean, so an African. So what does it mean? I have lots of brothers who are Mabena in Wamhlanga. I'm a Mabena from Zimbabwe. We need to have this discussion. I know that the minister says his area load shedding is coming at 12, so we might lose him at 12. And Comrade Ian Beddowes argues that the load shedding is caused by abandoning national planning and adopting neoliberal policies, which the minister also spoke to. So we invite Comrade Ian Beddowes, an internationalist, to speak to us briefly for about 15 to 20 minutes. Comrade Beddowes.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I want to start, I'm sorry to the last speaker, but by having a little bit of a disagreement with the last speaker. We are not living in a post-colonial society. We are not living in a post-colonial society. We're living in a neo-colonial society. Colonialism has only changed its form. It's not yet dead. I think, I made a list of some of the most prominent leaders taken away from us by colonialism, either sidelined or murdered, since the beginning of the colonial struggle. Dedan Kimathi, the leader of Mau Mau in Kenya, London Freedom Party, was hanged by the British in 1957. Then we look at Ahmed Ben Bella, who led the first major liberation movement, armed movement against the French in Algeria. After a couple of years, he was removed from power. Then we look at in Mali at Comrade Keita, who was the first president, but because he believed in progressive policies, Modibo Keita, he died in prison. We look at the greatest Pan-African leader of all time, Kwame Nkrumah, who was removed from power. We look more recently at Thomas Sankara. We look at the most horrible, the country with the most horrible history in the whole of Africa, in DRC. They murdered Patrice Lumumba. His successor in the liberation struggle, Pierre Mulele, was butchered while still alive after trying to make an agreement with the imperialist puppet, Mobutu Sese Seko. And then again, the next president who tried to do something in DRC, Laurent Kabila, was murdered. Again, if you come down to Southern Africa, what happened in my country, in Zimbabwe? They sidelined Joshua Nkomo, and they killed the Zanda commander, who was willing to do a deal to let the Patriotic Front standers one, Josiah Tongogara. And here, they killed Chris Hani. Here in South Africa, they killed Chris Hani because they didn't want him to be the next president after Mandela. And there's a reason for all of this. There's a reason for all of this. And it's called the neo-colonial agenda. How did the neo-colonial agenda start? Yes, it started where I started with the armed conflicts in Algeria and in Kenya. The imperialists, the major imperialist powers, Britain and France, recognized they couldn't carry on in the same way. They couldn't just carry on with direct colonialism. So they adopted the policy of neocolonialism by the late 1950s. Yes, brother, we put you in prison. We stopped you from being a leader. Now you can be the president. You can have your national flag, the national anthem. We will control your economy, and we'll give you a nice 10% on all our deals, so you'll live in luxury. And that's what has happened in Africa. When we come down to South Africa and Zimbabwe, what happened? First of all, let's get rid of one misconception, which is very common. We've got the concept that the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe and the liberation struggle in South Africa were anti-imperialist struggles. They were not. They were not. The Rhodesians and the Boers are not the imperialists. The imperialists live in London, they live in Paris, and they live in Washington. Those are the imperialists. By the time they came down to Southern Africa, it was obvious that the white racist settler regimes could not last. They could not last. So what they wanted those settler regimes to do, they wanted them to give way to, like the rest of Africa, to black governments which would toe the line. And of course, the Rhodesians and the Boers said, no, we're not relinquishing power. But they had to make sure that in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe and South Africa, that they removed those leaders who would create economies which were independent of their control. And they did that very effectively. They did that very effectively. And like I spoke to our chair earlier on, and yes, I said, load shedding is precisely because of the neoliberal and neo-colonial agenda. Because neo-colonialism in around about 1980 was actually added to by neoliberalism, which has badly affected the whole world. What does neoliberalism say? Everybody must become an entrepreneur. Now, before 1980, I would probably have had to look in a dictionary to find what that meant. But now all our children are being taught to become entrepreneurs. They've got no skills. In South Africa, in practical terms, we've got a continuation of Bantu education, where we've got so many children who are illiterate and innumerate. They can't even work in a shop because they don't know how to change money or how to... They can't. Why? Because of the education system, which is geared not for production. Yes. And production is the issue across Africa. And I'm very happy about some of the things that Rob Davies said. Now, before you can get production, you need electricity. You need electricity. If we look at the Soviet Union, people, oh no, that happened a long time ago. But what did the Soviet Union do under Lenin? The Russian Revolution happened in 1917, the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks. But they had a civil war which lasted till 1922 after that. By 1920, although it hadn't completely finished, Lenin said we have to electrify the whole country. He got a guy called Khrushchevsky, who was an electrical engineer. So from 1920 they started to electrify. Now, you're looking at the country the size of the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. They electrified the country within 12 years. By 1932, the first phase was finished. By 1941, when the Nazis invaded, they tripled that production capacity. Why can't we do the same? What is wrong with us? It's because we were told that we don't need state planning. In 1996, South Africa adopted the GEAR program, so-called Growth, Employment and Reconstruction. And what happened? Thabo Mbeki told us straight, yeah, we've got enough electricity. Yet we were supplying electricity to the African population which hadn't had it before, which was very good. But the way that the economy was organized was along neoliberal lines. And if you want to read Frantz Fanon, he actually says that in 1961, he says that when African countries, and he talked about the African elite, he talked about people only having an approximate bookish idea of the economy. And what did we do in South Africa and in Zimbabwe? We got neoliberal academics. Oh, these are experts in economics. We didn't look at what kind of economics. They're expert in economics. And there we had Trevor Manuel in South Africa, and we had Bernard Chidzero, who was trained by the World Bank, the IMF, in Zimbabwe. And it was even more catastrophic in Zimbabwe because we had a strong economy bequeathed to us by the Rhodesians. And this is where we've got this very interesting problem, because the Rhodesians, in their own peculiar way, were anti-imperialist because they didn't want to adopt the neo-colonial agenda. And if I'm 75 now, so I read some of those Soviet handbooks for African economists during the 60s. What did those handbooks say? They said, don't try to develop socialism too early in Africa, but develop economies which are independent, where the commanding heights of the economy are government owned or controlled. And there's only one country I know that actually did that, and that was Rhodesia. Except that they didn't do it for the majority, they did it to perpetuate, or to try to perpetuate, the rule of the white minority. And all during the 80s, what you bought in Zimbabwe, even after the Zimbabwe became free of direct colonial rule, what you bought in Zimbabwe was made in Zimbabwe by and large. We had economic independence. And that was not destroyed by the Rhodesians, that was destroyed by the ZANU-PF government, which adopted the ESAP, Economic Structural Adjustment Policy, just the same as the GEAR policy. They adopted that policy in 1991. Free trade. We started importing instead of exporting. Our economy went down. And we had black economic empowerment, or indigenous empowerment in Zimbabwe. What does that mean to the majority of the African people in either country? What does that mean? It means that the black elite is being looked after, and for the most part, the black elite are not even real capitalists. What's the difference? A real capitalist will exploit the workers, will set up a factory and put in machinery, the workers will come to work, and continuously the capitalist will exploit the labour power of the workers. He'll pay them, every week they come back, and in the end he's making quite a big profit. What do the majority of our African capitalists do? They loot. We call them the parasitic black bourgeoisie. And I know the South African Communist Party doesn't like to use the word black, but they say, I'm black, I'm formerly, before this I was sidelined, or what are the words that they use. But what do we see here in South Africa? I'm a builder by trade. I worked in the construction industry for 45 years. Now, when I came into South Africa from Zimbabwe in 2008, after the collapse of the economy there, I saw what was happening in the building industry. And this is what's called black economic empowerment. Right. Typically, in the old days, a building worker, carpenter, bricklayer, electrician, whatever, would work for, let's say, Murray Roberts, a big white-owned company. But he would be a member of the trade union, and he would have certain rights as a worker. What does black economic empowerment mean to him? It means now that a subcontract is given to an ANC member who knows nothing about construction, and that ANC member will then give subcontract again to a Zimbabwean or a Mozambican who does know construction. But what does that do to the worker? First of all, he's got no job security. He has to, instead of paying just his white boss, he now has to pay his black South African boss and his Zimbabwean boss before he gets the pittance at the end of the day. And it's destroyed the trade union movement. This is the reality of so-called black economic empowerment. It's disempowered the majority of the people of South Africa and of Zimbabwe. It's disempowered them, it hasn't empowered them. It's empowered an elite, for the most part, which doesn't understand production. And Comrade Rob was exactly right in saying production is central. And we cannot have production without electricity in the modern world. State planning comes first. And by the way, in terms of management, the great Lenin, please, if you can get hold of it online, write it down. Left-wing childishness and the petty bourgeois mentality. The question of management is of vital importance. By the way, the first two sections deal with are not relevant. It's the last three sections, the 5 sections. After the revolution, the Bolshevik government nationalized all industries, but it kept the same management. And some of the so-called left communists were saying, we must get rid of these old bourgeois managers and put our guys there. And what did Lenin say? Rubbish. You don't know how to manage a factory. The ownership of the factories had become national. It wasn't going to the capitalists. But the management, yes, they still kept the old management because they knew what they were doing. Then they put, they would put a political commissar, they put the workers' committee to oversee that management. So they couldn't do just what they wanted. And they made sure the young guys were there to understudy the old guys. What do we get in Africa? Why are we told that nationalization doesn't work? Because instead of putting experienced management, which may be white, it may be Indian, it may be Zimbabwean, it may be Russian, it may be Chinese, instead of putting experienced management and putting our young people to study it, we put the nieces and nephews and brothers of politicians who loot for their families. They don't know what they're doing, and and they loot. And what is happening to our children when they go to, if they go to university? Very few of them are doing practical subjects. Very few of them are becoming engineers. We have the problem of water as well. How many African water engineers have we got? Comrade Solly Mapaile, at the set time they were talking about land reform, which I thoroughly agree with. I worked with Chenjerai Hundri in Zimbabwe in terms of land reform in Zimbabwe. I believe in land reform. But Solly, Comrade Solly, visited agricultural colleges in South Africa. At the time there was a lot of talk about land reform. And by the way, land reform is not mainly about agriculture, it's mainly about what's under the ground. But anyway, visited agricultural colleges. What do you find there? White South Africans, and where there were blacks, there were mainly Zimbabweans and Mozambicans. So now you want to take over agricultural land which you don't know how to use. So the question of educating our children from young, even to know basic mathematics, to become literate, that is very, very important. And then as they go up, we've got a skill shortage in South Africa. Those who are not maybe suited to university, we want them to become bricklayers and carpenters and electricians, welders, tailors, shoemakers. It's not happening. So when I hear of a certain minister recently suggesting that once we get rid of all the foreigners, we'll create 2 million jobs. Has he got any idea of political economy and how an economy works? No idea whatsoever. So what we have to get back to is national planning. The last thing I want to say is this. We have the BRICS summit here in South Africa in August. BRICS is going to give us a window of opportunity. We're going to escape from the clutches of US terrorism, of US control. You know, we've got AFRICOM, Africa Command here in Africa. They created major war in Congo. They backed Uganda and Rwanda to invade Congo with the biggest war in Africa ever. And yeah, you talk about conflict in Africa. 80 to 90% of the conflict is caused by US intervention. And then we had the destruction of Libya. By the way, the leader of that was the first African-American president. What happened after the destruction of Libya? It was genocide against black Libyans and reintroduction of the slave trade. Thank you very much, black Americans. So, what we have to do now, the defeat of NATO, which is happening now on the battlefields in Ukraine, and the downgrading the US dollar. By the end of this year, the US dollar will probably be toilet paper, and if not the end of this year, by the end of next year. The US dollar is going down, it will no longer be the major trading currency. So, what's going to happen now is that we will get a window of opportunity. Look, the Chinese are far from perfect. We've had problems with them in Zimbabwe, but government to government will do much better deals than the West. And going back to load shedding, why do we have to go to the white minority to, I'm just finishing, to put solar panels? Why can't the South African government and the Zimbabwean government do deals with China and say, we want solar panel factories? Why can't that be done through ESCOM? What's wrong with the thinking? So, we've got a window of opportunity, but it won't be done for us, and this is where my final word. Each and every country in Africa needs a national development plan. If we don't have national planning, we cannot just move away from the West to China and Russia and think everything will be all right. It's our responsibility in Africa to have state planning. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Comrade Ian Beddowes. He is our commissar. So when a commissar speaks, they will not conclude. I'm not sure if the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Swaziland is here. I didn't see when they entered the comrades. Okay, he's not here. Is there a comrade from the ANC? Comrade Nandipa from the ANC is not here. Okay. If comrade from Kosato arrived, do you have a comrade from Kosato here? Okay. We welcome Comrade Tifund in Zimande. She's an author. I see she's carrying a bag. I will assume that they are books. So it's important that while we're having this discussion, there's a table outside for registration. You might want to display your books there so that when we exit this hall, comrades can have a look into your books. Then when we have lunch, you can then be providing them with those books. Comrades, there is a conflict that is ongoing in Sudan. As we celebrate Africa Day today, I've said earlier on that in 2013, the African Union adopted the theme Silencing the Guns in Africa. Guns are getting louder in Africa. We see what is happening in Mozambique. We see what is happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We're talking about